Okay, it's Wednesday, July 2nd, and I know that I am late to the game on birthright citizenship. I was traveling for a beautiful family wedding, so congrats, Jamie and Eddie, on your wedding. But now we're back to work, and this decision came down while I was literally in the air. And I wanted to give you my thoughts on it. As I've said before in the Supreme Court rulings, the previous one being the third country deportations, when the Supreme Court said we can't have these nationwide injunctions, so we're going to allow the deportations to proceed until the appeals process is carried out. Well, that's exactly what happened in the birthright citizenship decision. They did not rule on the substance of birthright citizenship. They ruled on whether or not the nationwide injunction, in other words, the court order. Remember, I said there's like 3 levels of court, right? District court, appellate court, Supreme Court. Whether a district court can issue these nationwide injunctions, not allowing action by the executive, at a nationwide level. And the Supreme Court, we already knew through these previous decisions, was hinting at it, and that's in fact what they did with the birthright citizenship decision. So let's take it back to the beginning. Back in January, when Trump took office, he said, hey, we're going to end birthright citizenship via executive order, essentially directing executive agencies not to issue passports to children born to parents where at least one of the 2 parents was not either a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. In other words, you can be born in the U.S., but if one of your parents are not a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen at the time of your birth, then effective February 2025, you will no longer be considered a citizen at birth, right? And so then these lawsuits ensued. And courts held that that was unconstitutional, and they said, hey, at a national level, nationwide, we're going to rule this is unconstitutional, and no administrative agency or executive agency can follow this. In other words, you have to continue to issue passports, essentially, right? And then the Supreme Court, it worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't say, hey, it's legal, or in other words, we agree that this group of people is not entitled to birthright citizenship. But they're saying, hey, these lower courts aren't allowed to pause this at a nationwide level. So now it is, but they did say, and Justice Kavanaugh wrote, that if you can certify like a class action lawsuit, then that would be the better appropriate way to challenge executive overreach. Now, we don't agree with this, right? Because what this means is that it gives a lot of authority to the executive, and courts can't put a stop to it unless they file class action after class action after class action, and it works its way up to the Supreme Court. And getting class certification is difficult, but lawyers are already on it. They've already filed lawsuits looking to certify anyone born after February, whatever the date is of the executive order, 2025, or after, right? And naming these groups of people as a class and saying, hey, the executive order is unconstitutional, and we are the named plaintiffs in the lawsuit. We want to be certified as a class. And so hopefully that is the workaround, that then, they certify the class action, the class, a district court certifies it and says, yes, it is unconstitutional. And now, again, the government has to follow the district court's order, not because it's a nationwide injunction, but because it's a nationwide class group of people. And they're already on it. They've already filed this lawsuit. So that's good. Hopefully, if and when it does go to the Supreme Court, they agree with the lower courts, which we presume will deem the executive order unconstitutional. And we will have once and for all a Supreme Court decision on, whether or not parents' lawful status is a requirement for birthright citizenship, which many of us in the profession do not believe it is. The way that both the 14th Amendment was written and how previous decisions have been issued, the previous jurisprudence. So that's where we are. Of course, if your attorney general in the state that you are in has not filed to challenge the executive order, then as of July 27th, which is when this, order can take effect, then, children born after that date in those states might be effective if that class certification has not yet come through and a decision hasn't been issued, on that, in that litigation. So I hope this explains a little bit of what's going on. I think it's really important to understand that this was about nationwide injunctions. It wasn't necessarily about birthright citizenship. It was about whether or not the courts could rule, lower courts could rule at a national level about whether something was constitutional. Now, the Supreme Court taking away that right definitely gives the executive a lot of power. It helps Trump be king like he wants to be. But I will say, and take this with whatever grain of salt you will, it's gone both ways. And when Republicans were issuing and filing lawsuits with nationwide injunctions and Democrats were in power, they also were very frustrated at nationwide injunctions. So it does go both ways. It feels more severe now, and it is more severe because we haven't had an executive branch kind of this out of control ever. And in recent history, and that's why it feels, so extreme to curb these nationwide injunctions.